Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 87. 4 Embassies and a Wedding. Last time, we saw relations cool noticeably between Antiochus III and the Roman Republic. Let's see if this is an aberration or else part of a trend. And yes, the title is definitely a pun on the film 4 Weddings and a Funeral. What can I say? I couldn't resist. We saw last time that Antiochus III dithered away the chance to take Cyprus for himself. By the time he got back to Seleucia, the winter of 196 into 195 had set in, and campaigning was no longer possible. Antiochus III holed up at Antioch for the winter. It was during this winter, as we've said before, that Antiochus Jr. and Laodike Jr. were married to each other, as had happened in Egypt and as had been customary with the Persians. Around about this time, the Carthaginian general Hannibal showed up in the area. He's definitely a famous name in the Punic Wars, but we'll leave that as a story for Autocrat. The point is, he's now in the area. He'd been evicted from Carthage during a power struggle in which his enemies had written to the Romans accusing him of being in cahoots with Antiochus III. The Romans sent a team to investigate, so Hannibal ran away. He was welcomed in Tyre, and then, a few days later, he showed up at Daphne to greet Antiochus the Younger. He then moved on to Ephesus and made himself available to Antiochus III, who presumably had moved from Antioch during this time. It's ironic to me how the Carthaginian accusations actually came true. Anyway, Hannibal was here, and in good time too. As the summer of 195 BCE arrived, it felt like a storm was brewing, or rather, a conflict. Here again, Antiochus faltered, trying to delay or prevent war. Now, the Romans were not likely going to fight on behalf of the Greeks in Asia. The Greeks in Europe, on the other hand, well, that was a different story. We've seen the Romans already react badly to Antiochus interfering in the region in our last episode. However, if the Seleucid king were to go back across the Hellespont for a second time, it would be as good as a declaration of war. Perhaps war could have been avoided if Antiochus had just accepted the respective spheres of influence, Europe to the Romans, Asia to the Seleucids. However, despite all we've said in the past about dithering, this was intolerable to him. Greece was the cherry on top of all that he sought to take. The Seleucids had seen all their rivals for power in the region kneecapped, but just at that juncture Rome was interfering. It could not be tolerated. In the same year, in the spring of 195 BCE, the commissioners from last time arrived back in the Eternal City. Their report was not a hopeful one. They felt that, had his attention not been drawn away, Antiochus III would have swept over Greece. Rome was unhappy with Antiochus, to say the least. At about this time, a conference of all the Greek settlements had been held in Corinth, under the auspices of a Roman governor. There, the Greeks had expressed their suspicion of Rome's continued encroachment into the region. This same encroachment included the garrisons which it was installing in various cities. Also in Corinth, Antiochus sent an embassy to the Roman Flaminius, but Flaminius refused to see the embassy if the 10 commissioners were not present. He advised them to go and talk to the Roman Senate itself. Rather than do this, the embassy returned empty-handed to Antiochus. There followed a year of inaction on this front. During 194 BCE, Antiochus III finished mopping up Thrace, while the Romans withdrew from Greece, leaving it to celebrate true autonomy. It seems puzzling to me that this is inaction when Antiochus has definitely crossed the Hellespont again and is in Thrace, but hey, maybe the Romans just didn't see Thrace as the problem, but instead Greece. Either way, this Roman withdrawal left a power vacuum and Greece was far from united. By the winter of 194 into 193 BCE, Antiochus III was back in Ephesus. For their part, the Greek cities had gone back to squabbling, while the so-called Aetolian League and Sparta were growing wary of Rome. An embassy arrived in Ephesus from the Aetolian League, namely from the brother of their commander. While this was going on, the Aetolians themselves egged on the Spartans to cause some local havoc. The goal here was that the Seleucids and Antigonids would join them in a grand coalition against the Roman Republic. The envoys to Antiochus hyped up how they would throw themselves into the fight and how strategically powerful they were. Essentially, I get the impression they're presenting this as a we can't lose sort of situation. The prospect of this grand alliance, including the Antigonids, was dangled in front of Antiochus as well, although in reality it was still only a possibility rather than a hard truth. Speaking from our previous decades of experience of Hellenistic infighting, it seems unlikely to me that Philip, an Antigonid who had just had his ego wounded by Antiochus, would have joined in against Rome, but that's just one take on it. Hannibal, seeing a chance to get revenge on the Romans for his defeat in the Second Punic War, egged Antiochus III on. Hannibal's proposed plan was that he would take 100 boats, 1,000 cavalry, and 10,000 infantry into Italy. At the same time, Antiochus III would attack Greece, and Carthage would rise up against the Romans. It would be a three-front war which would properly kneecap Rome. After all, he insisted, it was only with Italy out of the picture that the Romans could really be defeated. Hannibal even dispatched a man from Tyre to go and scheme with the pro-Hannibal faction in the city of Carthage. However, despite what we've said about resolution, Antiochus hemmed and hawed. I don't know, but perhaps he saw Thrace as his rightful territory, but felt hesitant about pushing Rome too far at this juncture. Either way, nothing happened for now. We next see him in Syria in the winter of 193 BCE, when the marriage between Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I took place. Antiochus accompanied his daughter down to the border, where she met her husband at Raphia. The two were married, and from now on, the name Cleopatra will be the most popular Egyptian royal female name. I'm also not entirely sure if this is the case, but I'm pretty sure that according to one interpretation, Cleopatra I is the last time that any new genetic material will enter the Ptolemaic house until the famous Cleopatra. All of this isn't quite chronological, as we will be going back to political wranglings now, but I didn't know where else to insert this snippet. Anyway, marriage and sunshine over, back to the politics. In spring 193, Antiochus's ambassadors were among those who made their way to Rome. They theoretically wanted to renew the friendship between Rome and the Seleucids, which had deteriorated since the incident at Lysimachia. However, they were really there to find out how far Rome would go in trying to dislodge Antiochus from Thrace and the Hellenic cities in Asia. Again, this seems to confirm that perhaps the Romans had quietly accepted Thrace for now, but Greece was the new front which they would not be budged from. Anyway, from what Flaminius and the Ten said, after they were ordered to speak with the embassy by the Senate, it was determined that Rome was not that interested in the Asian part of the question, but was very interested in the Thracian matter. Flaminius hinted that, should the one condition be met of withdrawing from Thrace, the other could be, forgotten. Flaminius said that, if Antiochus wanted them to leave Asia alone, he should leave Europe in peace. The envoys protested that Antiochus III had a claim on Thrace, but this logic didn't work. Rome's dominance in Greece was threatened by Antiochus's Thracian expansion, and this eclipsed all other arguments. While the Seleucids dithered over Thrace, Rome would continue to back the Greek cities in Asia. The Seleucid envoy Menippus pleaded the Romans to come to a peaceful settlement, and the Senate was not particularly keen as of yet on the idea of war. Instead, they sent a new embassy to Antiochus. This is made up of 3 people who are all called Publius, so instead of going through everyone, I will be calling this the Publian Embassy. In their journey east, the Publians were told to go to Eumenes II and find out where exactly he stood. Now, we should discuss Anatolia ourselves as well. Antiochus had been trying to get a united front against Rome, and Bithynia and Cappadocia were on his side. The Cappadocian king Ariarathes IV was, after all, the husband of Princess Antiochus, as we discussed in episode 84. Antiochus had even hoped to marry another daughter to Eumenes II himself, smoothing out relations that way. He offered her hand and many other promises besides, but Eumenes turned the offer down. Rome was closer, after all, and Pergamon knew how strong and dogged Rome really was. The Publians landed in Pergamon in 192 BCE and were welcomed by a Eumenes II who was eager for a fight against the Seleucids. He, like Hannibal in the Seleucid camp, now became a voice for war. Just as Bevan does, we will take this opportunity to segue to talk about Hannibal, as it was his presence in the east the Romans were the most concerned about. They hated him and feared him, as he had come very close to destroying them in the Second Punic War. In 193 BCE, Hannibal had tried to get Carthage to rise up, and the Romans had also found out about his scheming with the Carthaginian factions. As for this rising, it seems that Antiochus had given Hannibal's three-front plan the go-ahead at some point, and so Hannibal had sailed to Carthage with 5 ships and called his brother Mago to him to help him out. It had fizzled out in the end, as Mago had been banished as well, and Hannibal had gone back to Antiochus with his tail between his legs. However, the Romans wanted Hannibal out, and tried to sow division between him and the king to do so. A further meeting between the Publians and Seleucids at Apamea was abruptly cut short when the news of the death of Antiochus the Young King reached them. As we saw in our recap on Antiochus the Young King, Antiochus III retired to grieve, and the diplomats politely withdrew. However, this wasn't the end of it, and there was a further meeting. At this conference, now without the king, the same old sticking points came up. Both sides now knew that a war was coming, and the ambassadors returned home to Rome in 192 BCE. Although there was as of yet no direct cause for war, no casus belli, it was coming. That's where we'll leave things for today's episode. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week everyone.